Some people think of trauma as a life sentence. And when I say the bad news, trauma is a fact of life, the good news is it doesn't have to be a life sentence. And there are ways that people can heal deeply from their history. There is more than hope. There are tools.
Welcome to Beyond Theory, a podcast powered by Meadows Behavioral Healthcare that brings you in-depth conversations from the front lines of mental health and addiction recovery. I'm David Condos. Today, the story of Dr. Peter Levine. Over the past 45 years, his pioneering work in the study of stress and trauma has shaped the way we understand our minds. But what drove him to study psychology and medicine in the first place? And what does he think will be the next breakthrough in healing trauma? Let's get out of the abstract and see how this applies in the real world. It's time to go beyond theory.
I'm Peter Levine. I'm a senior fellow at the Meadows. And actually, apparently, I've had that role for somewhere around 15 years.
Wow.
Maybe even a little bit more. So having an interview kind of gets me thinking a little bit about that history, that story.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Levine, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here at the U.S. Journal Training Conference in Arizona. Thank you for being here.
Sure.
All right, so let's start with your story. So you can take us back to the beginning, kind of the thoughts that you had about mental health and trauma early on that inspired you to become who you are.
Well, you know, I was receiving an award in 2010. I think the book had just come out, and a Lifetime Award. And I was surprised to see my brother John in the audience. And because I've always felt that he somehow didn't think that my work was scientific enough. He's an MD, PhD.
Okay.
And he discovered the placebo, the endorphin-mediated placebo response. It really opened up the whole field of healing by using one's own brain-mind processes. So I mentioned something about being a very curious person. I've always, I think, looked at how, why, what. And after the award ceremony, I went out to have lunch with John, my brother, and he told me the following story. I must have been about 8 or 9, and he would have been about 6. And then I have another younger brother who was about 4. And in the summer, we lived on my grandfather's farm in upstate New York. And what we would do, we had a red wagon, and we'd pull a load of fruits and vegetables down Pine Tree Road, about a mile on a dirt road, and we would sell the produce to at a bungalow colony that, you know, people were there for the summers.
Okay, yeah.
And we were so cute. Can you imagine the three of us with our wagon?
4, 6, and 8, you said? Yeah.
So we mostly sold out except for one head of cabbage. And we had stopped for a rest. And then John pulled the wagon, and I noticed that the cabbage head went to the back of the wagon. And I was really curious about that. So I went around and I sat by the side of the wagon, and I had him pull the wagon, and I realized that the head of cabbage didn't go to the back of the wagon. It stayed exactly where it was, and the wagon came forward. So after we got home, I told my mother about this, and I tried it 3 or 4 times, and every time it was the same result.
So you're running a little science experiment.
Exactly. And my mother said, "Do you know something? You just discovered Newton's first law of motion." So
Too bad that Newton guy came and discovered it first. You would have had the Levine law.
Yes. Well, I'm happy to leave it that way. But again, it's I've always had that I'm always curious. I mean, I'm curious about how things work in the nervous system and animal behavior. But I'm deeply curious about how people have gotten to where they are. When I see a person, I actually really like the title of your podcast, Beyond Theory. Theory is important, and I've developed over the, as you said, 45 years, a fairly intricate theory, which can be taught. And it's now taught. I started teaching about 12 people in Berkeley, and now it's grown to about 50,000 people worldwide in 42 countries. So the science of it was very important, and being able to convey it to other people. But I also realized that really what people learn, the deeper part of what they learn, is through transmission. So I would, in the Meadows, a lot of what I do is I'll work with a group of the patients in one particular program when the therapists are there. So they get a sense of how I contact the person, how I contact myself first, but how I contact the client, and how that connection allows us to move in some very deeply, often profound healing.
And so the transmission is that connection.
That direct connection, exactly.
Yeah. And so kind of growing up, having this curiosity that eventually led you to study medicine and psychology, right? So what motivated that?
I was studying, an interdisciplinary program called medical biophysics. And that was and I got the PhD there. But then, I felt that I should also learn some significant degree of psychology, of the theories. And so I also I guess I'm an overachiever, did a doctorate then, as you know, in medical biophysics, or in psychology.
Yeah. And so the kind of seeing how the brain and the body are so connected.
Exactly. And what I learned at that time, when I first started to work with people, there was no definition of trauma as it is today, because that was in the early 1970s. And the definition of trauma as PTSD hadn't really come into being until around 81, I think 1981. So I had a number of years. And in some ways, I guess you could say I was unfortunate because I didn't have that to build on. But more than that, I was very fortunate because I didn't know that trauma was supposed to be a brain disorder, a brain disease that was incurable and could only at best be managed by medications and by trying to change the person's thoughts. So I discovered when bad things happen to us, our body reacts in a very specific ways. And what happens in trauma is our body doesn't go back to where it was before. It stays in this stuck place. So a key in working with trauma and somatic experiencing is in finding out how the trauma has become lodged in the person's body, and then helping them move through that stuck place. So I see it as moving from trauma, which is fixity, back into flow, into here and now presence.
Yeah, and so, like you said, you've done this kind of work for over 45 years, almost 5 decades. Kind of lay out some of what that was like back then. Because the world has changed a lot. Yes, so what was the thinking of trauma?
Good point. Well, as I mentioned, trauma was seen as a brain disorder, a brain disease that was not curable. I think that at that time when I presented, my work, I began to teach it. And there was a small group, as I mentioned, about 12 therapists from Berkeley, and we'd meet every couple of weeks in my treehouse right outside in Wildcat Canyon outside of Berkeley. And when I started to give some public lectures, I think some people kind of were scratching their heads. And I think at that time, some of the psychiatrists, I think, were put off because a lot of my interest is based on observing animals in the wild, in their natural environments. And I learned to watch people, to observe people, and to really see subtle shifts in posture, in color change. They could read the heartbeat from the person's pulse and so forth, carotid pulse. So I could monitor when a person was shifting, and I could accompany them through that shift. So I think at that time, some people, often psychiatrists, but not only, thought this was a little bit airy-fairy.
And so there was some skepticism.
So there was skepticism. Now, I mean, that rarely, can't even think of the last time something like that happened. I mean, it really is coming into the mainstream. Actually, in March, I'm going to be giving the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Psychotherapy Network. So that was really what's the word I'm looking for? The mainstream of psychology. And so I think now, instead of this being a little bit outside, fringe a little bit, it's now come into the mainstream. So I'm seeing that award, not just for my work, but for an appreciation that this really has changed the culture of psychotherapy, bringing the body in. That was the missing piece in therapy.
Yeah. And so, and over this time, these decades that you've had to work and study in this field, you've gotten to be in some pretty interesting environments. So I know one of them is NASA in the early days of the space shuttle.
Yes, that's right.
How'd that come about, and what'd you study?
That's a little bit of a long story, but I, when I finished my undergraduate work, one of the things I wanted to do was I wanted to be a NASA engineer. I went in a very different direction. But then after I published my thesis, which was on stress, the thesis I think was called Accumulated Stress, Reserve Capacity, and Dis/Ease. And so I was really interested in how people break down under the loads of stress. And so
how it affects them physically?
Yes. Yeah. Physically, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. And so working with my clients at that time, building a practice, one of the clients was the flight surgeon at NASA. And so one thing led to another, and I was invited to come and visit there. And then I had a year contract with them to be, it was kind of like almost, I guess you could call it postgraduate kind of thing. And so I was working with people whose reserve capacity has broken down, have lost the resiliency, the capacity to bounce back from these different things that have happened to them.
Because they've been under so much stress?
Yes.
From their job?
Well, no, from stress from their childhood and trauma, stress and trauma. And that really, broke down. And so I was working with that side of the human condition. NASA were the cream de la cream of resilient people, of the astronauts, the early astronauts. And so this was before the space shuttle. And one of the things that they were noticing is when they went into orbit, went into zero gravity, some of the people would throw up, would vomit. It's called zero G sickness. And it's not just unpleasant, but, if some of the vomit got into the console, into the computer, it could be disastrous. So they wanted to be able to to get an idea of when the person maybe was gonna vomit, and then be able to somehow do something with them to stave that off. So, I don't know if you want me to get into the detail of that. But so when at liftoff, the heart rate accelerated to a very high rate. And then the people who did not develop the sickness, their heart rate went up and then slowly came down as they went into orbit. The ones that had the problem, usually their heart rate went up faster than the ones that didn't, went up faster. And then near the top, there was a quick dip, and then it went up again, and then it took a good while to come down. So I was discovering that there are two branches of the nervous system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And this takes me actually to a very, very important collaboration and colleagueship with a man named Stephen Porges, who developed a theory called the Polyvagal Theory. But what we were doing is, it was like the accelerator and the brake was at the same time. So their heart rate was going wild. Then they slammed on the brake, as it were. And then that's when the symptoms would appear.
Because that was the body's response.
That was the body's response. So again, having the range of working with people who had really very difficult childhoods and things had really broken down for them. And the people that were very high resilient, but still there were places where their resilience went down. So it was really an important experience because I could then kind of use some of what I learned with the astronauts and apply that to the clients that I was seeing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so you mentioned the polyvagal theory. Mm-hmm. I know that's
Stephen Porges.
Yeah, that's very connected with some of the work that you've done. Describe first what that is as an introduction, and then how it's connected.
Well, actually, I met Stephen Porges. I found an article by him. This was back in the 70s. It was way the polyvagal theory wasn't until 1994. And I was very interested because he was making a mathematical model of coherence. And I was looking at people's coherence and when the coherence broke down and when the coherence was reestablished. So I told him a little bit about, my observations with the astronauts and especially where it dipped down. And he said, when we met, it was a love affair.
You were speaking the same language.
We were speaking the same language from a different point. I, as a therapist, as a clinician, and he as an academic. And when I told him about that data and that it looked like the sympathetic was going on at the same time, the parasympathetic was going on at the same time as the sympathetic, brake and accelerator, he said, that's not possible. But I have this data, and I showed him, how I plotted these curves. And we've stayed in contact for all that time. And then in 94, he published his first article on the polyvagal theory. And so in a way, we kind of went full circle. One of the things that he asked me to do was he wanted to publish a book on clinical applications of the polyvagal theory. And so I made it kind of like a personal thing where I shared our relationship through these decades. And in a way, kind of ironically, I've published a number of scientific articles in scientific journals, and he's now teaching to a lot of people who are working in holistic and alternative kinds of therapies. So it's kind of like we've gone full circle as brothers.
The overlap of your worlds has coincided.
Yeah.
And so I know another kind of milestone on your journey was working with the American Psychological Association. We're working with people after natural disasters, after war, seeing what PTSD can do.
My organization does a lot of work in areas where that, where you have that kind of mass fatalities and that kind of stuff, ethnopolitical warfare. And this was actually a group of people. They were from the American Psych Association, and we met in this. I can't remember the name of the town in Connecticut. It was actually happened before the United Nations. It was a meeting place of people from different countries, and what we were trying to do is put together a syllabus for graduate students to be able to study these things, because at that time most people didn't really know what trauma was. And so it was a way to kind of bring that into the academic settings.
And so what did you find? Like, what did that teach you about how trauma affects us?
One of the things it told me is when you go to a place where there's trauma, show up, shut up, and listen. Listen to their story, and also know something about how that culture views what we call trauma. They may not have that word, but they have a way that they've dealt with it. So it's really important, I felt, to be sensitive to the culture that we were working in. And at that time, there was one person who was one of the leaders of what's called critical incident debriefing. And so they would go in after a trauma and get the people to relive the traumas over and over, the worst part of the traumas. And I was very much against that. No sense in injuring people twice or thrice. So we kind of talked that out. And later it was shown that that approach, when used, is re-traumatizing and actually usually makes people worse. So again, finding out how the culture that you're working in, how they understand trauma, how they understand loss, what rituals they are already using, and how we might be able to add something to their rituals.
Right, because they're experiencing it even if they don't use the same word that we do. So
exactly.
They have some response.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you want, I can tell you a little bit of a story about this. I was able to I took quite a bit in Brazil, and it was one of the countries where I did a lot of my early teaching. And it was arranged that I could go and visit this pretty remote Indian tribe, the Kranaki people. And it took us about 18 hours of driving from Belo Horizonte and another 3 or 4 hours on a 95 degrees trek through the jungle, and we're totally sweating. And so when we arrived, the chief met us, and I said, why did you come? It's a long way. And so I explained that I was interested in trauma, and I was wondering, how he deals with trauma in his tribe, because they experience a lot of trauma of being dislocated, finally coming back to their land, and the farmers burning all of the trees to make it,
uninhabitable.
And they had to piece by piece put all those pieces back together again. So I think he felt a little bit sorry for me. So we went out into sitting underneath, a papaya tree. And we sat on this mat, and he had a whole bunch of flutes. So he just started playing the flute. And then I asked him, I said, would it be okay if I picked up a flute and tried to play along with you? And he said, yes, that's why they're there. So I played for a while, and then I was definitely in a little bit of a different state at that point. And I asked him if he knew about sustos. That's the Portuguese name, sustos, for fright paralysis, which is what trauma really is about. And he said, yes, he knows about that. And he said he knows also about the word trauma.
He knew that word.
Yeah. His daughter, the princess, actually was the first of anybody in the tribe to go to high school and then even to college. So she brought some of that back into the tribe. Beautiful, beautiful young lady. Really, really smart. So he said, and he was so right, he said, okay, I understand that. But you know what you're not understanding is that it's community that's essential. And they do rituals together in community. And now I'm coming back from spending time at the Meadows campuses in Wickenburg. And what have I been doing? Working in community, working with people, supporting each other in their healing journeys. And that's been a big part of my role at the Meadows.
Yeah, it's back to that transmission, that connection.
Exactly, the transmission, the connection, and the support in groups.
Yeah. And so we touched a little bit earlier on kind of getting your perspective over these decades. You described the landscape of how we thought of trauma back in the 70s. How would you just say that that's changed? I know you said it's become much more a bigger part of our language, but
anywhere you look, newspapers, celebrities, everybody's talking about trauma, and people are speaking out about their traumas, and often people who are, very famous people in the entertainment industry, because they have an audience. And so it's so much in the center of our politics, of our medical care. You know, the medical needs of people who have been traumatized are so vastly greater that it's it's an essential thing if we're going to make healthcare actually work. Is that we have to understand the role of trauma and what we can do to help people who have experienced trauma and toxic stress, sometimes called toxic stress.
Yeah. And so kind of understanding that that's connected, that is a part of our total healthcare.
It has to be part of our healthcare and of our educational system. It's at the center of all discourse right now. So it went from the fringes to the center.
Yeah. And so what, obviously we've come a long way. What might be one misconception that's still out there? One thing that we're still missing, one step further.
I think some people think of trauma as a life sentence. And what I say is the bad news. Trauma is a fact of life. Well, just a fact is a fact of life. The good news is it doesn't have to be a life sentence. And there are ways that people can heal deeply from their history of danger, of threat, of accumulated stress.
So there is hope.
There is more than hope. There are tools. And again, that's one of the things that's been very exciting for me in working at the Meadows is when I came in, the people who were, the leaders in the field at that time, Pia Melody, Claudia Black, for example, John Bradshaw, they really welcomed me. And so it never really seemed as a competition. I mean, maybe a little jockeying at the beginning, but we were
on the same team.
We're on the same team. We're collaborating together. And so I think that's another important thing because a number of us have different lenses on trauma, but nobody has the whole story. And I think that's also the hopeful thing of people coming together who have these pieces in a collaborative way.
Yeah. And so maybe this coming together is the answer to the question. But for the behavioral health field, just like culture, it's come a long way in our understanding of trauma and how to help people heal. What would be that one next step for treatment providers, for those in the helping profession?
Well, maybe to stop calling it behavioral health, because it's not just about behaviors. It's about how we are with ourselves. Of course, our behaviors change, but if you're just trying to change the behaviors without changing the person's inner experience, it may be helpful, but it's going to be limited.
So it's more than that.
It's much more than that.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so, Dr. Levine, thank you so much for your time. We'll dive in even deeper on somatic experiencing, on some of the books you've written about trauma in the next episode. But before we break, looking into the future, we've talked about your perspective. Looking into the future, the next 5-10 years in this world of healing trauma, where do you see this going? What's the next challenge to overcome? Or what's the next breakthrough?
Well, I think the centrality of the body, of the living, sensing, knowing body, I think that's what's going to be the big paradigm shift. I mean, I think it's already happening, really.
So just understanding more about how the body and the mind are connected.
Exactly. Yeah. Mind, body, mind.
Dr. Peter Levine is a psychologist, a medical biophysicist, and a senior fellow with the Meadows, based in Southern California. And he'll join us again in the next episode for a deep dive into the somatic experiencing approach that he developed. Find out more about Dr. Levine's work at traumahealing.org. Beyond Theory is produced, written, and edited by me, David Condos. You can discover more from this podcast, including other conversations with Meadows Senior Fellows at beyondtheorypodcast.com. Finally, thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join us again next time for another episode of Beyond Theory.